Hello, this is Tom Stebbins. I'm the county agent for Hamilton County, Tennessee. This is basically a master gardener lecture, but any other gardener could chime in and look at it. I call it CSI Plant Diagnostics for the master gardener class. So I put this together basically before, let's see, put this basically together to help master gardeners and others diagnose problems in their landscape. And I try to make it funny a little bit here. I just say, Jeff Foxworthy, you might be a Tennessee master gardener if you dig a hole to plant a petunia and you keep digging till you have a pond, or the garden center calls you at home to see if you are all right because you haven't been in for a few days. So anyway, I got this idea from CSI. And CSI, there was an episode that was the most popular episode on TV for quite a long time. And it had to do with fire ants. Fire ants were running, well, there was a guy in CSI, his name was Nick. He was buried in some place and by the bad guys. And so they were trying to figure out where he was buried. He was buried alive, and they could see a window facing up, and all they could see were fire ants crawling around, and they knew it was somewhere out west. So they looked up the bill of sale for all the shipments of plants that had gone out, and lo and behold, they rushed to the nursery that had the shipment of that may have had fire ants in the shipment, and they were able to find out the new grave or the new place where that was dug. Anyway, it was a popular episode, and I still like CSI for that reason. So anyway, if you're going to do diagnostics, you need some just basic tools. It's nice to have a little sweep net to look for anything that's crawling or flying. It's good to have some little jars with maybe some alcohol in it to collect some insects. It's good to have a container for things that you collect, maybe a knife to cut out pieces of material. It's good to have a paper form of maybe what you're going to be looking at, a few books and things to kind of guide you on what you might see. Little hand lens. I like to have a little bigger one than that. A compass. A compass might tell you which direction on the tree the moss is growing. And of course, just a notebook. So, and you can have other things too. And it's good to collect books. A lot of us collect books on trees and shrubs and more horticultural stuff, but it's nice to have things like butterflies, beetles, and other basic manuals. Really help us out. Even experienced diagnosticians have just the basic materials. And also in this day and age, it's great to have a nice digital camera. Most of the time we have a nice smartphone that gets us going. So we usually have our capabilities right with us. Here's a form that's used for UT. It might be a little dated, but basically it's the same thing. Try to get the name and address. If you're trying to help someone out, it's often important to know what part of the county or city they live in. It helps to know if they're on the top of Signal Mountain or Lookout Mountain or down in the valley. It's also nice to know what parts of the plant are affected and what they look like. Pictures can often tell this, but it's nice to have some verbal verification as well. And there's some fees if you decide to send this off to UT Diagnostic Clinic to get samples. And so there's a lot of help for problems. And I like to look at master gardeners as the start of that system. Here's you could even adapt a lens on your iPhone to make it into a microscope. Some of them have it built in right now to enlarge the photos. And the images get sent up to Nashville, and there's specialists up there. Dr. Hale still still working up there, and he often looks at the samples. Dr. Voss is retired, but there's people that have taken his place that can help throughout the state. And if they can't do it, they send it off to other researchers, different places. And here's some of the experts, the resources I tell everyone that you probably know weather experts in your vicinity. So they can tell you if it rained or how cold it's going to be or how cold it was. You should have a nice little relationship with your nursery. They're usually plant experts of some degree, and they can tell you at least what the name of the plant is. If you've taken a Master Gardener class, you have met Master Gardeners who are experts in different aspects of what daylilies or roses or perennials or whatever. There's just lots of expertise there, so it's nice to call a friend. UT specialists are basically a call away. It's nice to try to do the top 3 first before you overburden the specialists with easy stuff, I might say. So, and then the labs. There's labs in Nashville and Knoxville that handle samples, and we can either do it by distance diagnostics or go through the county agent or through a Master Gardener and get your questions answered. And then I try to teach in this lecture diagnostic websites and also how to search for it by Google or some other search engine. I like to look at it from the standpoint of a detective. You could look at it from the standpoint of a medical person too, and how, to ask questions, to diagnose what went on, who, what, where, when, and why. Different questions to ask. Either you're asking your neighbor or asking yourself. Just get you started. Who planted it? What type of plant? What's the cultivar? Where did the plants come from? When were they planted? Sometimes that's a big help. What's the recent weather? Maybe 2 weeks ago, was there a freeze? What kind of activity? Was there construction nearby recently? And plants are a little different than people. You can't just ask the plant what's going on. You have to look at it, and sometimes it'll tell you if you look close enough. So I tell people, ask questions. And if I was doing this in a lecture, I would encourage everyone to raise their hand or speak up to say, what would you ask? What question would you ask right now if you saw this plant? Would you say, oh, I know that plant? And if you do, hang on a second. You may or may not know the answer, but you'd probably say, is that real? I mean, is that healthy, that the plant is green and red at the same time? Or is there something going on there? We see some shadows that don't look like spots. Well, let's say we saw, so we might want to know first what that plant is. So how are we going to figure out what that plant is? I tell people the way to do it is to take pictures or take a sample and take it into your garden center. One of my Master Gardeners recently had a nice little app on her phone that she thought was pretty good, and I agreed. She was very accurate, and it was called iNaturalist. I don't have the website, but just look up iNaturalist. I'm going to try to use that more and more. But there's no replacement yet that I know for just finding someone who might be familiar with that plant. And that plant is red tip Photinia. So once you know what the name of the plant is, that opens up a whole new ballgame as far as figuring out what's wrong with it. Then you could type that name into Google. You could do a search engine on it. You could say red tip Photinia. Of course, red tip kind of tells you right there that it's somewhat of a common natural occurrence in that plant. If the plant looked like that, and it was a red tip Photinia, you might, in your search, discover that there's a very common problem in red tip Photinia called leaf spot. And so fungal leaf spot can occur. So then you could go from there. But the key usually is identifying the plant and then going from there as far as diagnosis. So you'd find out that was a fungal leaf spot. And then normally if you pick a site that's a university site or a well-respected nature center or a botanical garden that has very good information. They can give you some kind of prescription for what to do on that. Excuse me. So here's another scenario. There's a plant like that. It looks like there's something going on. There's a white material. Often you have to get a little closer. You have to get down on your knees maybe. You have to break off a little piece of that plant. So from a distance, I would have said, well, maybe it's just in flower, or maybe it's just maybe there's something maybe it's sunburn or something like that. So you look at it a little closer, and it's not a flower. It's got some kind of a white. It was green, and then it turned a little white. So then you might ask questions about the environment. If you took or watched the other videos on my disease and insect talks, I talked often about the disease pyramid. And the disease pyramid works like this. There's three parts. There's the plant, there's the environment, and then disease, if it's there, could be a big part of it, disease or insects. So you break that down. You could say, well, first of all, the plant, does the plant ever look like that naturally? And I would say no to this, because we break off a piece of plant and we find out that's boxwood. Then I'd ask, what's the weather going on? What was the weather in 2 weeks ago or last week? And if someone said, well, we had a frost last week, then I'd go, aha, I think that's probably what it is. So I might even type in Google or one of the other websites and just see if they've got any pictures on boxwood frost injury. And if it's in the spring, that's another clue. You know, it goes without saying if it is the spring, but maybe somebody brought it in and you didn't realize or showed you a picture. Anyway, and you could do a lot of things with this, and we'll get into several scenarios. One is you could ask a question, is it fertilizer injury? And maybe you could ask around, and sure enough, someone was either applying some fertilizer, or maybe it was an herbicide. Maybe if it wasn't spring, if there was no freeze, and someone was spraying their lawn with a little weed killer on that certain day, so then you go in that direction. So there's a lot of things to do as a detective, figuring out what's going on. Here's kind of a tricky one, and it's a plant that has some spots growing on it. And again, you'd ask what plant it is if you're catching on to my little story here. And I'd say, let's just wait on the name. But I was at a garden center one time, and I saw this plant, and I saw the spots, and I thought for sure, because I'm a pathologist, I thought for sure that plant was diseased. And so I looked at it a little closer, and oh yeah, it looks like a disease. I turned over the leaf and didn't see really any spores. I was ready to pick a few leaves and maybe take them to the diagnostic clinic or send them off to the Nashville clinic or take a picture. But then I decided to go down to take the plant down to the register, or at least find a garden center employee. So I did, and so I decided to ask a few more questions, and I could have ran the tests. I could have taken them home and look under the microscope to my office lab. But then I talked to the person in the greenhouse, and lo and behold, they said it was this name, leopard plant. So it tricked me. It was a plant that just looks like that. So don't be confused. Always figure out what the plant is, the name, if you can. That can go a long ways into telling you if it's natural or if it's something you have to work on. Often we see problems in the landscape that we just know it's not a good thing. We see trees that are chopped off. In this case, we see maybe there's some damage down here. Maybe it's a car accident. Could be a disease because there's just so much mulch around this tree that could be smothering that trunk. Looks like telephone poles going in. So that's a great place for the tree to get freeze injury or get smothered and have disease. So in this case, too, you'd ask several questions. first thing you'd ask is what kind of tree it is. And I often have people raise their hand, and maybe one or two out of the whole class will know exactly what it is. If it was this part of the season, they might not know, but once the leaves came on, they might realize real quickly that this is Bradford pear. And so then, and the volcano mulch is the first thing people see. Topping is definitely bad the way it was done here, but they had to do it because Bradford pear was just a bad choice. So that was the very top first thing. And they just shouldn't have. This was in, I think, county property up in Williamson County when I was living up there. So they probably didn't, they chose a very bad plant to put in there. And so they had to chop it, they had to mulch it, they thought. So poor tree selection, canker maybe, and just a problem. So here's another. I'll set these up so you can see I'm setting up these different scenarios. Here's one. I'm just going to say that, let's say the plant above is all yellow and it's not doing good. I'm not going to tell you what it is right away. It probably doesn't matter. But let's say it's yellow on the top, and here we got all this mulch around the base of the tree again. The tree doesn't look, it just looks like too much mulch. We would call this volcano mulching. So we could make a hypothesis that this tree is dying from poor fertilization or whatever. But often we have to look inside that mulch pile. And if we do, in this case, we would find that it was still in its own ball, wrapped in burlap. There's a miscommunication with people. They think that burlap will probably disintegrate, which is true if you waited for a year or two, but often that's, you don't have time, the tree doesn't have time to have that all deteriorate. And a lot of times it's made out of treated burlap that's not going to decay very quickly. Sometimes there's a poly cord, it's not cotton, that keeps that on there. So we're uncovering, we're looking, we're snooping into that. We're finding that should be cut away. Maybe even the burlap here should be taken off the top, because it could just wick the water right out of that root ball there. So wrong way to plant. Definitely, there's lots of this that goes on. There could be at least 3 mistakes. The burlap is still on, too much mulch, and maybe the soil fertility is the problem. Here's one that I put in here just to have people think. And the way I set it up is I say, here's a tree that looks like it's got some kind of a problem, that something here on the bottom, and you want to touch it. You want to see if it's gooey, like a fungus, or if it's sawdust coming out. I see a few holes coming out of the tree. So I look at it a little closer, and I threw in this little case file in 1951, because if you're as old as I am, you remember these two guys that were on Dragnet, and they didn't always agree on what was going on with the case. And so one would say, okay, let's look inside the tree. So they want to save, they might not be able to save this tree. So they'll cut it down and they'll take a cross section, and maybe that's what they'll see. Then if they saw something like that, they would realize, wow, this is serious. And so we probably need to treat the other trees in the same block. Now, if they saw this, maybe that was just a one-time thing, because it looks like the tree might have been sitting in some water. Somehow it got infected. Maybe just that tree got a problem. And so the other trees, especially if you didn't see any holes in the bark, you might diagnose and say, well, it looks like maybe that's just a fungal rot. So you'd read up on both of these things and see which one maybe needs immediate control measures, spray of some kind, or maybe just take it out and save the other ones from that. Okay. Here's this is a very common problem, very interesting problem. You've got maybe a downtown area, and you've got some pretty, medium-sized trees. These trees are probably 5 or 7 years old. But then I'm going to say, back in here, there's a little open spot, And there's trees that are, can't see them, but there's trees that are much, much older, much, much higher, and they're dying. They're, for some reason, they're just not doing very well back in there. So I ask, what could be the problem? So students might say fertilization, they might say some questions, and they could be very right. It doesn't mean they're going to die just because they're bigger trees, but sometimes they weren't taken care of. This is a site where a big tree was there and they were trying to save it. They didn't put any guards around it. The workers probably parked their trucks underneath there because it was a shady spot. So I'm saying that these older trees, probably in new construction, are not going to make it. Often a young couple buys a brand new house in a subdivision, and they'll buy a house that has a nice shade tree. And lo and behold, they don't realize that how did that shade tree survive when there was a sidewalk put in, there was water lines that were put in from the road. So it got cut, the roots got cut every which way. It's looking good now for a year or two, but in about 5 years, they're going to pay another couple $1,000s to remove that tree. So it's probably better to get the lot that didn't have any trees and just plant them yourself instead of going for this older tree. Unfortunately, construction damage. Here's a scenario where a walkway, and it's showing, I'm not sure if that's privet or yew or something. It's hard to see, but I'm just saying that there's some dead underneath. And again, it could be a lot of different things. So if you ask questions, look around, I say that in this case, the hint is in the little, it's in the little marker right here. And so you can see that's University of Maryland, that's the clue. And so up north, we did this a lot. We had a, especially at a public building, we put a lot of ice de-icer, which is a salt, and it splashes, but it's important to use it to keep from slipping and falling. Even down in Tennessee and around here, we do that occasionally. And this could have been other things. It could have been a dog run where dogs are going all the time on those bushes. It could have been lack of sunlight and all those things. So we might even, there might even be a disease underneath there. So we would take a piece of that plant and maybe take it into the clinic or take it into the county agent and look at it a little closer. But chances are our clue right there with salt damage would be a good wise choice. So here's two problems. One over here, I try to go through these separately. One here, we see a spruce tree that is showing probably something that's just dying or something dead. So if you ask the questions, what time of year was this? I would say it was middle spring. It was coming out of winter, and all this new growth was occurring. And what happened to make that new growth limp over like that? Was it a chemical? You could ask if there was anybody taking care of this tree and did they spray something bad on it? Or look at the weather and see if the weather just showed up. But the first thing is spruce, and we would look it up in the spring and you'd see these beautiful, nice light green, they call them candles, coming out. And why did the candles get browned out? And most likely it's a spring freeze injury. The one on the right, we see that it's a big leaf, rhododendron, or I think that's what it is. And you see that the margins are browning out. Now, when water comes in up through a plant, it has to go through the petiole and through the veins and get out to the edges. And then the water vapor goes out these parts on the edges of the plant. So that's a lot of times if the water can't make it up there, that's where it's going to be a shortcome of the water. So why is this? Again, if we ask the question, when was this? And I would say it's coming out of late winter, early spring. So we would know that it's not a disease probably because there wasn't any spots but it's on the edges. So with big leaves, a lot of times, oh, that's a magnolia, I'm sorry. And a lot of times the wind is really whipping up, especially if you're on the hillside of the mountains or just on a place where a lot of transpiration is taking place. Often the wind just pulls the water right out of the ground. And even in the wintertime, you can have a lack of water. And for big leaves like magnolia and rhododendron and others, hollies can occur like this. If there's lack of water, sometimes there's just a drought going on in the wintertime. Here's a tree that's setting in a situation. It looks like it's in the sidewalk. Maybe there's a good reservoir underneath there, maybe not. But the tree is probably looks like a maple to me. It's good to know the tree, that's for sure. In this case, we see that it's probably middle of the summer. It's probably that reflection of that cement is just bouncing off of that young new growth of a tree, and it's going to die probably. So maybe even watering, it'd be nice to check the water if you could somehow reach in there and see if there's moisture in that reservoir in that ground. But in this case, it's probably pavement heat stress, just the bouncing of that light down, off of that surface, that light surface, causing stress. Here's an interesting situation. There's a pretty big tree with a discoloration on one side of the tree. And I think it's further away than the power lines. Somebody said, well, maybe the power lines are going through here and maybe the tree trimmers cut that back and there could be some disease in that one branch, which is a good hypothesis. See, we're making up hypotheses and then trying to follow through and see if we can prove it. In our case here, it's nice to get a little closer to the tree. And if we got closer, maybe we would see something like that. This isn't the same tree, but it could be. But on trees similar to that, we get this longitudinal, bark disruption. And so you can see it's healing up. There's callousing going on. So maybe that tree isn't going to die anytime soon because it's trying to come back. But if we look closer, sometimes we see trees with these streaks all the way down. And by now you've probably figured out this is a lightning injury. That's lightning. And here's a familiar plant, hosta, and it looks to me like it's not really in the shade. We all know hosta is a shade-loving plant most of the time. There are I guess there's a couple of cultivars that can make it in the sun. But this one looks like there's some kind of damage, and I would call this heat stress or sunburn. It could be a very hot situation or maybe a drought. Well, let's say you've got one that looks like this, hosta with a streak. It doesn't really look like the last one, but there's a streak going through it. And this may be a bigger puzzle to some folks who haven't seen this before. It's a very uncommon problem. And you might have to take some leaves and take it to a garden center, and they might even have to take it to the diagnostic clinic in Nashville. And if they did, they'd find out that this one is a result of a worm called a nematode that gets inside of the plant and gets inside of the veins and just causes this yellowing. It's not very common, but it does happen, especially with hosta aficionados who change or exchange hostas. Often you can get in trouble by exchanging hostas and getting some from a bad source, putting them in your garden, and these guys don't jump over very quickly, but over time they can move through cuttings through different to your other plants in your garden. It's called a foliar nematode, and most of the time they're in the ground, but in this case they're in the leaves. Here's a very, very common problem that we get questions on. It appears that there's a lot of dying going on, but if you look closer, you'll see that The dying is the older needles. And so if you looked up, first of all, if you found out which pine this was, you'd find quickly that it has 5 needles in a bundle, and that means it's a white pine. And so if you looked up white pine, brown needles in Google, chances are you'd get something that would say it's very natural. It's a fall needle drop. It's just losing its needles just like a deciduous maple tree or an oak tree would. But it doesn't do it the same every year. Some years are worse than others. Some years it drops a lot of needles, other years it drops very few. Here's a interesting, right at the soil line. And most people can figure this out real quick, but I call it the first job of a college student who really wants to do a good job. So he's got a string, he or she's got a string trimmer and thinks they're getting really close, and they're just touching ever so softly this tree. And this happens to be a dogwood tree, and it could be a maple, because maple, dogwood, and a few others have very thin bark, and you just can't touch that bark, especially with a string trimmer, very hard, and it'll cause this to be girdled. I've seen professionals do this because they think they're really good at the string trimmer, and all they're doing is just tapping very lightly, but that's enough. It's like touching someone with delicate skin and getting a big red spot on there. But in this case, string trimmer damage. Here's a couple rose questions that we're trying to figure out. So if you're asking questions, here you see some roses that have some blotching on it. They're not really spots, but sort of a blotchiness to it, dark blotchy. So if you thought it was a rose problem, the first thing that I would say is trying to figure out if it's a knockout rose or not. If it's a knockout rose, then maybe knockout roses don't get very many leaf spots. Next thing to do is to look at it real closely. Maybe look at the underside of the leaf. Yeah, if it's a knockout rose, then maybe you'd rule out that it was a disease. Maybe you'd have to look for something else. Something else might be spray burn. Maybe there was a chemical applied, or maybe it was nearby where pollution could, from a running car, something like that. But something might be causing that problem besides disease. Here's another rose that looks a little yellow. So from the first thing that you look at, you'd think, well, maybe it needs fertilization. Maybe it needs some nitrogen, because it just looks like, but the whole leaf isn't yellow. So again, make sure you look on the underside of the leaves of any plant you're trying to diagnose. Columbo's a little bit confused. But if you look down the underside of the leaf, you might see something like this. You might see some 2-spotted spider mites, and you see spider eggs. You see some problems there. And so once you diagnose this, then you realize that, okay, it's probably fertilized properly, but maybe we just have to get a miticide to kill the mites on that problem or that plant. So it could be either or one, spider mites or nutritional. Here's another one. Got some spots in the yard, and these could be a lot of things. So the first thing to do would be to look right at the edge. Often if it's a disease, there's going to be a transition. So if you're going to take a sample of this and bring it to the county agent or send it up to Nashville, you would want to take your sample right on the edge, because if it's brown patch, which is a bad disease of lawns, they'd want to look at what it looks like right on the edge, because diseases are going to be moving out. They're going to be growing and moving out. If it's not a disease, maybe it's something like a fertilizer. Maybe someone threw extra pellets of fertilizer in there. That could be a problem. So I use this as sort of one of my ending slides. I go, and people say, oh, that's a dog. But I say homeowners don't have a dog, but their neighbors do. So often the neighbor's dog comes over and does its thing on your lawn, causes these in the wintertime, and that's the result. But it makes you think, could it be a disease, or or an animal of some kind. Could be grubs as well. Here's another tricky question. If you know what this is, don't holler out. But it's a watermelon that has spots on the leaves, and even it gets on fruit. So first time I saw this, I was afraid that this fruit just wasn't going to make. It was going to get worse, and it did. It got a lot of spots. But those of us, or those of you who have grown up on the farm or just had experience in gardening, probably already know what this is. It looks like it could be a bad problem, but you cut into the melon and it looks perfectly fine. And this is called Moon and Stars watermelon. Here's another example of what looks like a disease or a fungal disease. Looks pretty bad. It happens to be on the calyx end of the blossom end, of the plants. And a lot of things can look like this. And it turns out that this is not, you could, again, Google this and say, okay, tomato spot on the bottom or pepper spot on the bottom. And what it turns out to be is this isn't a disease caused by a fungal pathogen. It's a disease called blossom end rot caused by a calcium deficiency. And if you're really up on your plant or your insect borers, this would maybe you might think these are borers, but they're in rows, so there's something there that's looking for something or causing a kind of a pattern. Here it happens to be Austrian pine, but it can be in a lot of different trees. And if you've seen this before, you know it instantly that it's just a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And they make the little holes. If you're seeing something that's huge, then and these holes are about the size of a pencil eraser, or actually maybe not even that big. But if they're huge, then probably another kind of woodpecker might be after your tree. This interesting plant is on another plant. These are called lichens, and they're not detrimental to their host. They're there because there's materials that they can soak and get moisture and maybe some minerals, but they're not causing death of the tree. A lot of people think they are, but they're a combination of an algae and a fungus. And one of my master gardeners recently told me that there's a bacteria involved with this as well. So it's a symbiotic relationship that makes up the lichen, but it does not cause death or harm to the tree. Actually, if you go in the forest, you'll see these all over the place, meaning that the air quality in a forest is great. So that's what we always tell people, that your air quality is pretty good here, but the tree may be just going downhill from other reasons. Then you might see these in the spring when it's really wet. This one's called dog vomit fungi because that's what it looks like. But basically, these are very, very primitive fungi, and they actually run like water through the mulch. Usually they're on mulch, and sometimes they can gather around the plant, but they're not pathogens either. They're just opportunistic fungal organisms. They're pretty interesting because they can be blue or yellow or brown or white. And these are called slime molds. And people think, how can you get rid of them? Well, usually a shovel can take a good gob of that away, knowing that probably there's more to it underneath the mulch. But at least you can get rid of the upper part of it. I don't think they're detrimental if animals, I don't know if animals would eat these, but that's a question people often ask. Will that harm my animals? Usually if you just shovel it away or just disperse it. If you disperse it, you're kind of making it go everywhere. But if you're drying it out too, that'll make it easier to manage. you can't really get rid of it. It'll occur when it's wet out and kind of go away and become powder when it dries out. And I kiddingly say that these things have been used in movies. The Blob probably was a movie that was based on something like that. So I tell people if you're diagnosing things, be a plant detective, be a medical pathologist, ask all those questions, and you could come up with some answers if you take it step by step and ask your experts in the local area. Maybe you have to ask the experts in the county agent or the specialist. Sometimes the problems are just self-inflicted. Sometimes you're the one that's not watering your plants or fertilizing too much. Often houseplants are taken care of too much, and so they thrive on neglect. Usually houseplants do. Diagnosis murder. So I'm just finishing up with my friend Jeff Foxworthy, who's I don't know if he's a gardener or not, but if you might just be a Tennessee Master Gardener if you know the difference between voles and bowls, or when taking your last ride in a hearse, you reach out and take cuttings off the wreath. So thank you for listening to the video, and I hope you have a great day and go out into the garden and look for some of your interest in insects and diseases and try to diagnose those problems. And thank you very much.